Okay, welcome to topic 5 of information system security. In this chapter, we're talking about top key topic is supply chain security. So, some of the stuff we're going to talk about here is supply chain risk and supply chain security. What are some of the security issues associated with building very complex supply chains? Some of the different threats and controls to apply chains, what they call supply chain risk management practices. So this is actually a couple of places to look at here. NIST Special Publication 800-161, which defines which defines chapters 1, 2, 3. Will describes a lot of this stuff. This is for supply chain risk management, specifically for federal information systems and organizations. However, the applicability of this can be, for other organizations, works equally as well. Couple things, a couple videos out here. Microsoft has their digital crimes unit has a video describing security risks associated with insecure supply chains. IBM Commerce also has a video about, from their perspectives on supply chain risk management. And then there's a video here also on vendor, consultant, and contractor security. So I guess to start off, when we talk about supply chain, what is a supply chain? A supply chain is really a set of processes and organizations that really are involved in the transfer of materials, both inbound and outbound, actually both materials and information, both inbound and outbound of an organization. So a supply chain can be inbound in terms of raw materials coming in. It can be used, is required for manufacturing. Supply chain can also be used for outbound out to customers, which could be from a manufacturing site to a distribution network out ultimately to a customer. All right, so that's what a supply chain is, and it's a huge part. It represents a big part of an organization's operations, what it's focused on. So, depending upon the type of organization, some organizations are much more. If you look at, for example, group I'm with, DuPont, huge. DuPont supply chain is a huge part of what they do, and similar to with Campbell Soup, both these organizations, have invested very heavily into the configuration, all of the supporting infrastructure for their supply chain, and quite frankly, the supply chain has a huge impact of the success or failure of the company. All right, so when we talk about supply chain risk, right, supply chain risk is the risk that somebody or some adversary could sabotage or maliciously introduce unwanted functions that are specifically, targeted at disrupting you know, the operation of a supply chain. Supply chain can be spanning manufacturing, production, distribution, installation, operation, maintenance, with bad intents. The intention to monitor, deny, disrupt, degrade, or functional use operation of the system. All right. So the idea of is supply chain being kind of a big part of what the heart of an operational organization is. A disruption either on the inbound side or outbound side could have a very serious effect. And actually, the thing about the supply chain, it can be targeted for disruption intentionally or actually in some cases unintentionally. All right. So a lot of times what happens is supply chains are driven by what we call commercial off-the-shelf software. So basically something you buy from a company, which potentially could have some sort of compromise within it, baked into it, or so some vulnerability can be exploited. But in addition, the complexity of supply chains, because supply chains can span multiple organizations. It can band geographies. So it's not, it can be made up of multiple parties distributed, across national boundaries. So the complexities of this stuff, of holding this stuff together, is become very significant. The numbers of information systems involved in a supply chain. So it's not supply chain is not necessarily one application. It can be a series of applications, all communicating back and forth. And each organization will, the nature of each organization will define the nature of its own supply chain. But we're seeing, the speed, the dependence upon, depends of the organization for supply chain has become very significant. A lot of effort, a lot of investment has been made to increase the throughput and the performance of an organization's supply chain. And a lot of times the success or failure of that organization is as we said before, the success or failure of the organization a lot of times is tied into the success or failure of the supply chain operations. So security, a couple different areas that we focus in here. One is obviously, you want to make sure the software that you are using to run the supply chain is secured and can be made secured and can be secured in a sustainable fashion. This is both the hardware and the software, purchased from trusted suppliers with emphasis on, these things have a strong emphasis on security, can be made secured, not only from initial startup, but as security as an ongoing concern. Um, the whole idea, as we talked a bit about, this idea of security and risk reduction, risk management. You want to be able to manage the way security risks is to be introduced into the product. So, basically you've got, a couple different dimensions of this. Obviously, the supplier capability. So, whoever's writing the software is writing it in a secured fashion. Um, Product security, making sure that, there's certain is subject to different security compromise and mitigation on an ongoing basis. Like I said, it's not a matter if you buy the software and the expectation is secured. It is the ongoing management of security is a requirement, for part of the ongoing operation of a supply chain. Product logistics, the being able to track and monitor any product that's in transit at least through each step as products are moving from place to place within the supply chain. And then operational product control, that that the products that are being that as things are being transferred and transported and moved from place to place, those there are no unauthorized changes made during the operational use of that. So if you go back a number of years ago, there was the Tylenol incident. I think it was back in the 80s, where somebody uh, went and basically went into uh, supermarkets and had uh, tampered with Tylenol that was on the shelf and basically put cyanide in it. And there was a number of people who were killed, which actually had a pretty big impact on how things are being done with operational product control, not just simply from the technology side, but more from as much on the product side, just as where you see seals and the way packaging is handled and things of that nature. So that's just all this is all part and part. It's a very holistic approach to this. So one of the challenges is that if you look at modern systems, a lot of this stuff is being done not being done within an organization. Is done outside of the organization, and it's actually a lot of cases it's being done, you know, at different locations globally. So we're dealing with a global economy with subcontractors are located worldwide. Um, one of the big challenges are large, complicated supply chains have a dependence upon this stuff. So the question is, when designing the security and be able to understand and trying to mitigate supply chain risk, being able to understand that your potential exposure can come from any a number of locations, both internally to the organization and externally as things are moving around. So it's a very big concern, and something that has to be built into your protocols for dealing with this stuff. Transports logistics of these components for use in IT. Um, you basically it's restrict you. The way this is done is by verifying, establishing access controls and effectively managing, access controls for a product on an end-to-end basis, so you don't have a gap. Obviously, if something, as you're moving from place to place, if you lose control of it, lose trackability of something, it could be potentially compromised. So the idea is being able to monitor things on an ongoing basis, restricting access, as to only those uh, those folks with authorization, and be able to also monitor and maintain the quality. I think we talked about the repudiation. So you can think about, when something goes from place to place, that the attributes of it, the characteristics of it, have not changed as it's moved from place to place within the supply chain. So common criteria, we talked about common criteria before, kind of a similar situation here. There's common criteria for third-party development and secure IT products. There's a concept specifically within supply chain, something we call supply chain risk management, or SCRM. It's really the idea of examining, analyzing the supply chain, and looking for and mitigating potential risks. So it really is kind of a very holistic. It's dealing with both uh, product logistics best practices, and extending those out to everybody who's involved, including whether they be internal employees or whether they be contractors or whether they be on site or whether they be at any place you know involved with the handling of the products. So things you'll see from a software perspective, design reviews, security testing from internal development, and with external teams as well. You want to have mechanisms to monitor supply chain for components and how things can be how risk can be introduced. Um, you're always looking for weaknesses. You're looking for vulnerabilities. You're looking for areas can be compromised, and then and then identify, establish, and execute countermeasures to mitigate those risks. That's really what this SCRM is all about. Third-party products, monitoring third-party products. This is a kind of a best practice, uh, a national cybersecurity awareness system. Actually, this is a link, so you can take a look at it. This is really just kind of a clearinghouse of information around, kind of it's really becomes very valuable to kind of see what other organizations are doing, and kind of what other companies or other organizations have experienced in this area, and kind of leveraging this from a collective learning experience. So the idea is, providing up-to-date information about impact areas of security, and then communication is through like bulletins, and the idea of as we as issues are discovered and mitigated, to be able to communicate it out to everybody, so you can see whether or not your particular aspects of your supply chain could possibly be at risk. Reverse engineering, hardware, software, reverse engineering. The idea of you know leveraging tamper resistance techniques of making sure that things are not cannot be compromised, cannot be modified, cannot be uh, changed. So this once again, this becomes a very broad in scope. It's not simply listed. It's not just simply IT, but it's actually for products. For kind of for products across the board. Specifically with some things about with technology would be with chips. If you look at processors, whatnot, making sure that processors cannot be reutilized, or basically rebranding discarded chips cannot be introduced into products, or I mean, this is more of a software, digital signatures, to ensure that if something is received, that it matches up. You'll see a lot of times, you'll see if you download something off the internet, you'll actually see you'll have the ability to run a check. And what a digital signature is basically it takes different attributes of a piece of software, generates a hash key, which then can be used as a signature. So you could verify that it has not been modified, that the program is what it should be. So if you make a modification to it, it does a recalculation, and if it's been modified, the keys will not match up. The signatures will not match up and indicate that is, potentially something has been compromised. NIST, the folks at NIST, once again, a lot of work with SCRM. They've defined SCRM controls, a list of the different types of supply chain threats, breakdown of really some of the different scenarios and analysis frameworks. So it's really kind of a model can be used, and then also a template. So a lot of very valuable stuff that enables organizations that are, that are really focused on their supply chain to kind of establish a framework through which they can monitor and manage this stuff effectively. And that is it for supply chain security.